Neither the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, the presenters, and the authors of this work, their employer, nor their employer's officers and directors warrant or represent expressly or by implication the correctness or accuracy of the content of the information presented. As between the AICHE, the presenter, and the authors of this work, their employers and their employers' officers and directors, and the user/viewer of this work, the users accept any legal liability or responsibility whatsoever for the consequences of its use or misuse. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker today, who is Dylan.
All right, well, hello and welcome to this AICHE presentation on compliance audits, leveraging your A-team. We appreciate you all attending, and we're looking forward to your questions and your feedback. This presentation, by the way, will be interactive, so we'll have some questions throughout the presentation that you can answer. So just be ready to use that chat box feature, and please, please, please participate. So thank you for that introduction, Nahima. I'll start by saying that, yes, I am a nuclear engineer by degree, but I really haven't split an atom since my last lab at Texas A&M. So after graduating, I jumped right into the oil and gas industry, and I've been here ever since. Currently, I serve as an account director / PSM consultant at Providence Consulting, and I've been here about 5 years. In that time, I've served a variety of client sites from major refineries to smaller specialty chemical facilities, and I've executed a whole bunch of different types of PSM and RMP type projects. Now, if you're wondering which type of project is my favorite, you might be surprised to learn that they are, in fact, compliance audits. So why do I like them so much? Well, really, quite frankly, the couple of reasons are just personal. I really enjoy to travel, see different parts of the country. I'm a history buff, so it's really neat to go to different areas of North America and learn about the history and the culture there. But the other reason is, as a child of the 80s, man, I love the A-team. I always dreamed about being a part of the A-team. I didn't quite envision it was going to be this way, but I think it's worked out all right. There's a lot of other professional reasons that I love audits. As a PSM consultant, audits really afford me the opportunity to gain an in-depth understanding of the intent of the regulation. I get to meet a lot of different subject matter experts that are really extremely knowledgeable in their craft, and each of them has their own unique perspective on PSM. By the way, you'll hear me refer to PSM a lot in this presentation. And when I do that, my intent is to include the EPA's risk management program as part of that. So if you hear me say PSM, it really includes RMP as well. So as I was saying, I get to network with a lot of different people and trade all sorts of ideas about the best way to execute the PSM requirements. And, the insight gleaned from those conversations really is invaluable. The other thing I like about compliance audits is it's just good to go through line by line the requirements of the regulation. I think it identifies areas that I could be more aware of, and that the sites that I consult with can be more aware of as well. So we've got a poll question here, and we talked a little bit about me. I'm curious to know a little bit more about you. And so as I mentioned before, this is going to be an interactive presentation that we hope you participate in. And so by submitting your answer on this poll feature, it'll help us understand who our audience is a little bit more and maybe tailor the presentation a little bit more to that. So you're going to see a few slides like this scattered throughout the presentation. So be on your toes, because I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these question slides, but I'll give you a few moments here to complete those answers. So what is your role? Are you a manager or a supervisor and responsible for the PSM and RMP programs at your facility? Do you function a lot of times as an audit team leader? And maybe you do both, but just pick one of the answers that it best suits you. Are you an experienced audit team member? Maybe you're really specialized in a certain element or something like that, and get asked quite often to be a team member on these compliance audits. Are you new to auditing? Are you part of a PSM group and want to know a little bit more about compliance audits? Or maybe a different group. So again, just a few more minutes here, and then we'll shut down that poll. All right. I guess, can we see the results here? Maybe not during the presentation here, but all right, I'll move along here. So I should start by saying that this will not be a step-by-step guide on how to conduct compliance audits. You know, OSHA, they have some really good guidelines out there to follow in Appendix C, as well as the OSHA Compliance Directive on this. But what we're going to discuss is really the audit method and how to incorporate each of the 5 audit aspects to get the most out of your compliance audits, and then use them to get maximum leverage out of your A team, which are the auditors. All right, so let's start with what the regulations require. So OSHA requires that PSM-covered facilities conduct a compliance audit every 3 years. Now, real quick, what that means is the date of your final report should be at a maximum 3 years from the date of your previous compliance audit. So if your last audit was dated January 23rd of 2016, your compliance audit is due today. Now, hopefully we don't have a bunch of people hanging up the phone and running to complete their compliance audits right now. But that's the way it is. So the dates have to be a maximum of 3 years apart. You also must have one person part of the audit that is knowledgeable in the process. Now, this illustrates the importance of really understanding the reg here. What does the word process mean here? Does it mean that they need to be knowledgeable in the auditing process, or do they need to be knowledgeable in the chemical process that is being audited? Well, the regulation is very clear on this. There's a very clear definition for what process is, and so it's clear that in this case, they're referring to a person should be knowledgeable in the chemical process and should be part of your audit team. All right, so moving on, facilities must have a report on their findings. So they must have these findings in some sort of final document. The facility then must have prompt responses to those findings, and they must retain the last 2 compliance audit reports. So indeed, when I go and I prepare for a compliance audit, the first thing I ask for is their previous 2 compliance audits, and I read through those findings. And when I look at the rest of the documentation and during subsequent interviews, I'm looking to ensure there is resolution of those gaps. All right, so what does the EPA require with regards to compliance audits? Well, the EPA, interestingly enough, for a long time had the exact same verbiage in their requirements as OSHA did. And then on January 13th of 2017, they came out and the Federal Register published the final version of an amendment with some additional regulation. And in that, certain conditions require that an independent third party conduct the audits on these facilities. And those conditions are basically this: if you have a release that causes some sort of serious on-site injury or death, or causes the public to shelter in place, then they will require an independent third-party audit. Or if the agency comes in and has an inspection and there are serious deficiencies, they may warrant that you have an independent third-party audit. Now, I don't want to get too much into this today because I'll go down a rabbit hole, and there's still some modifications that could come about the regulations. So originally, this was supposed to go into effect March of 2017, and since then, there's been 3 petitions from the industry that have caused the EPA to delay this implementation until February 19th of 2019, or next month. So the rules are not in effect right now, and there's these petitions and the time until it's in effect. There's still some room for this to change. So maybe a webinar down the road on these specific EPA requirements. Now, what OSHA and EPA are still completely aligned on are the purpose. And basically, it comes down to this: do you have procedures and systems in place to meet the intent of the regulations? And are you doing what you say you're going to do? Are you following your procedures and systems? So, for example, you're auditing employee participation at a facility. The employee participation requires that management consult with employees on the development of PSM programs, and you're reading the procedures, and you find that this facility has the EPIC program. EPIC stands for Excellence and PSM Initiatives, Now, that program has quarterly meetings because all the stakeholders and or subject matter experts in the facility, they discuss their health of their PSM program and come up with tangible corrective actions. Well, that sounds pretty good and would meet the intent of the regulation. So you check that procedure off as tentatively passing that compliance audit requirement. But when you get to the facility, you can't find any records of these EPIC meetings taking place. There's no meeting minutes. There's no sign-in sheet. There's nothing. And when you interview, no one knows what the EPIC program is. Well, that's a pretty good indication that the program isn't happening as intended and would be a good basis for a finding. Conversely, you may find nothing written down as a procedure outlining a plan to consult with employees on the PSM program. But when you're interviewing, you find that, oh yeah, we have these meetings every month, and we review our MOC programs, and we meet once a quarter to go over actions from PHAs or inspections or incident investigations, audits, and so forth. So in this case, the facility is practicing the intent of the regulations, but they've got no written program. Well, that's a finding as well. See, I like to think of these written programs as sort of the constitution of PSM. Now, you can change and modify these programs, but it's more of an amendment style. You basically have to get these ratified through the MOC process to change what is written. And by writing them down, these programs are much more resistant to just changing willy-nilly and to the direction that the management teams that get changed out every so often want to go. And they may have a very different opinion on how they want that program to run. So having a written program is important to stating what you want to do. All right, so let's really dive into our objectives now and discuss the 5 aspects of the audit method. Again, this is not a chronological step-by-step method on how to conduct a compliance audit. So the first aspect is approach. You want to define the type of audit that you want. You want to select the right team and properly prepare. Understand. Take the time to really comprehend the what and the why behind the regulations. Document. Ensure that the results of the findings are clear, concise, and consistent so that they can provide maximum benefit to the facility. Interview. Set the tone for your interview. You want to ask the right questions and anticipate the personalities. And then team building. You want to build rapport not only within the audit team, but also with the facility personnel being audited. So let's start with A, approach. So first, it is really important to start with the basic question. What does the facility being audited want their audit to be? Do they want the compliance audit to be a true basic compliance audit where the only findings are related to non-compliance are documented? Now, I would suggest that the official copy of the compliance audit report just solely be that, deficiencies in compliance. Or do you want your audit to be a more deep dive audit that examines opportunities for cultural improvements or opportunities to implement industry best practices? So, for example, I'll go back to the employee participation program. So you might have a program in place with a comment drop box where employees can provide feedback on PSM programs by dropping a card in the box, and management reviews once a quarter. Management can show where these comments are reviewed, and they have led to a few changes taking place. So there's a written employee participation procedure that has something generic about management shall consult with employees on a regular basis, and then has the example of the drop box listed. Well, you could make a valid argument that having the written procedure in place and the practices that they're doing satisfy the minimum for regulatory compliance. I would agree with that. However, it does seem like the minimum program possible. It feels like something is lacking compared to other programs that are out there. So in a best practice cultural type audit, it might be documented separately from the compliance audit report that the facility consider a more robust employee participation program, such as having quarterly team meetings where each team has input into specific elements. In my experience, I've sometimes heard these referred to as business process teams or BPTs. So you might have one on employee participation. You might have another on on MOC and PSSR, another on MI, etc. So these teams would meet once a quarter and review the health of their element and create trackable actions to improve and develop their programs. This would be an example of a best practice, and you may want to have a recommendation to establish something like this as part of your audit. Now, I should note, if they take you up on that recommendation and then put something in their employee participation procedure to have these quarterly BPT meetings, then all of a sudden that's you say what you're doing there, and that becomes compliance, not just best practice. So again, I can't stress this enough. Best practice and cultural findings do not belong in the official compliance audit report. But when you're doing compliance audits, it can make a lot of sense efficiency-wise to look at these other items if that's what the facility wants. So we got another poll question coming up. We're curious to know how your facility handles your compliance audits today. Is the facility looking at items from strict compliance perspective, or does it look for cultural improvements or opportunities to improve with industry best practice? Now, some of you are probably wishing that there was an all of the above button here, but just envision they're in increasing levels, with A being the most basic to C being the most comprehensive. I should also note that there's no wrong answer here. The strictly compliance-based audits, they're typically more inexpensive, and based on the type of the facility you have, they may be the most appropriate selection. So we're curious to know what you typically do at your facility. I'll give you a few more moments here to complete that poll. All right, Nahima, can you go ahead and close that? All right. All right, so for each audit, you really do want to put together your A team and spend some time selecting who's going to be on the audit. Ideally, the team members will be diverse enough to have their own strengths that cover each element of the audit, and also have a general understanding of PSM as a whole and how those pieces fit together. In my opinion, it is not just important to have team members who have a whole lot of experience, but it's also important to have someone new to compliance audit. This quote-unquote new person should really be someone who's talented, perceptive, intuitive, and preferably have a decent level of expertise in at least one of the elements they're covering. So the first time that I ever brought a new person on board the audit team, I got to tell you, I was a little bit nervous. But I have to say, I think what it ended up doing was it really elevated the quality of my own personal auditing and really the audit as a whole. I've found that injecting new blood into your audit team often sparks some really thought-provoking questions and insights that just make you understand the reg better, improve your audit questions and so forth. So I do recommend having a new person on your team. Now, a couple of points here. You want to decide on what elements each member is going to audit. For a new person, I wouldn't give them anything incredibly difficult. I'll typically assign them a couple of easy elements such as employee participation, compliance audits, trade secrets, etc., and then maybe one that's a little bit more challenging item based on their expertise. You could also pair them with another experienced team member. For the rest of the team, there are a few elements that I really think you should choose your auditor carefully on. The primary among these being mechanical integrity. So it's my opinion that mechanical integrity is the most extensive and difficult element to audit without sufficient expertise in the subject. So first, at least on Providence's audit form, it is by far the most expansive checklist we have. And second, you really have to know the ragged gap. So a lot of cases that means things like API 510, API 650 and 653, for design and inspection of atmospheric storage tanks, the API code on positive material identification, for example. So it really is important to do that. On our audits, we typically use a senior API certified inspector that ends up spending a full 2 days on MI alone. We're fortunate enough with our inspector. They have a lot of experience. They actually sit on the API boards and help develop those API codes. So it's great to have someone like that on the audit. I've been on the periphery of a couple audits and reviewed multiple ones from the past where the MI portion really did not get the attention that it deserved. And I think this occurs generally due to a lack of expertise on the previous audit team. So I would argue that there are a few elements where you really need some experience to audit them. Particularly MI, as I mentioned, I think PHA is probably another one. And while RMP mostly mirrors the PSM regulation, I think it's always helpful to have a team member who has prepared an RMP submittal in the past. All right, so in summary, you select your A team to encompass a wide range of experience and expertise and then assign the elements. But where do they come from? So let's ask a poll question here. Who makes up the audit team at your facility? You know, so you can have personnel from that site that's getting audited. That in fact you want a person, at least a liaison, that is knowledgeable in that chemical process. You can have internal corporate resources and maybe subject matter experts that get called upon at different times to go to the site and audit. You can have a full-time corporate audit team. That's all they do is audits. I've seen that quite a bit. Probably keeps your audits really, really consistent from site to site. Do you hire outside consultants or other resources to end up doing your audit? Or do you kind of do a mix? You know, I've seen that quite a few times where you might have someone from the site, some corporate experts, subject matter experts, a dedicated corporate audit lead, and then you've got a PSM consultant or something like that that comes in and fills in that a third-party role. So, all right, we could close the poll feature on that and move along here. So, all right, the approach, setting up your plan. So you really want to plan your approach to the on-site audit and interviews. And so the initial document review, that's going to help you guide on how you plan to address each PSM element. So we recommend reviewing as much upfront as possible, a lot of preparation time, so that your time on site is really spent on interviewing and trying to address the gaps that you found in the documentation. So as I mentioned, the first thing you want to do is pull the two most recent compliance audits. That's going to be a great indicator of where the gaps were before, and you're looking to see that they've closed those gaps prior to this audit. This phase is also going to include a review of SOPs, MOCs, PHAs, PSI, etc. OSHA recommends that the sample size on this documentation should be statistically significant. Now, sometimes I really think that this phase can be one of the most challenging of a compliance audit. Upfront communication and setting the expectations with the facility that you're going to be auditing is key to setting up a successful audit. And this process really can start up to a couple months in advance and just setting the timelines of when things are expected and giving adequate time to get the documentation that you need. So based on the document review, you can plan the workflow of your audit. And I usually start out with the elements that appear to have the most gaps because those usually take the most time. And then based off of the documentation, you can start to plan who you're going to interview once you get to the site and then the questions that you will ask. All right, on to our next element, understand. Understand the what and the why. So first, it is important to understand the why behind each element. So we have provenance. We like to break up the 14 elements into 5 PSM mindsets, and they all relate back to the hazard or the highly hazardous chemical. So the first PSM mindset being to identify the hazard, and this really encompasses the first 3 elements of the regulation: employee participation, process safety information, and process hazard analysis. The second mindset is that you must communicate the hazard, and you do this through your SOPs, your training, and your contractor management program. The third mindset is you must protect against the hazard, and you protect against these hazards by having adequate PSSRs, a robust MI program, and hot work practices. Fourth PSM mindset, reevaluate the hazard. You accomplish this through your MOC process, incident investigation, and employee planning and response. And then the last PSM mindset is transparency of the hazard through compliance audits and trade secrets. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of overlap here And the knowledge that you need to conduct a great compliance audit really needs to get a little bit more detailed. But the PSM mindsets are really a great foundation for understanding the intent behind the regulation. And so where do you get that deeper understanding of PSM? Well, I think it's really good to follow the outcome of citations and court cases where judgments are handed out to show how the law is actually being interpreted and enforced. Conversations with OSHA auditors to see what they look for are obviously valuable. There are over 140 letters of interpretation that are available that can be immensely helpful in understanding the intent, and quite often they're my go-to resource. Academic papers are out there that hold really valuable insight and ideas into PSM, and of course, I recommend attending as many AICHE webinars as possible, though I'm probably preaching to the choir here. So these things are all very helpful, but I think maybe the most important is have the actual regulation in your hand as you audit. You know, and this touches just beyond 1910-119, the PSM reg, and 40 CFR 68, the RMP reg, but it also includes several other portions, including the code in 1910 referenced by the PSM regulation on hot work and emergency response and things of that nature. And then you also want access to the applicable RAGA gap, particularly under the MI portion. Now, I prefer myself to have these regulations printed, and even though I know them, feel like I know them pretty well, I always end up referencing them numerous times during a compliance audit. So next, we really want to explore ways to elevate your checklist beyond a simple check the box, whether an item complies or it doesn't. So you want to craft a checklist that helps elicit understanding regardless of who is auditing. If your company doesn't have a checklist, man, I recommend you get one developed ASAP. For compliance, the checklist should incorporate the individual requirements of the regulation, the compliance directives, the letters of interpretation, citations, court rulings, etc., everything we just talked about. And then you can also have, if you're going to plan on executing best practice audits, you can have best practices in that checklist, like those found in Appendix C. They can be added. Just be sure to designate them as best practices and the other ones as actual compliance, and that way you can keep track of it when separating your final report. So this checklist really should give as much context as possible so that different auditors would reach the same decision. It's also important that the checklist be considered a living document. It's not static, it's living. So prior to each audit, you should review the recent decisions, the citations, letters of intent letters of interpretation that may have come out, and clarify more what the regulation is saying. So before you audit, always check for those things and then update your audit checklist accordingly. And then additionally, as you audit and you come up with questions and you're looking for context and you find it, if the checklist doesn't answer that, you should update your checklist so that the checklist is clear. So for an example, I once served as an RMP auditor on a corporate audit team. Now this company, they had a really mature audit process and they had a great checklist. It was online, it was computerized, it looked really, really good. And as I was going through the questions, one of the standalone questions was, does the RMP submittal list the most recent incident investigation? And when I looked at it, the RMP submittal that they had sent in was blank under the most recent incident investigation. Yet I knew before that submittal occurred, there was a fairly serious slip, trip, and fall incident that resulted in an incident investigation. So it wasn't listed, but there was an incident investigation. Should this be a finding? So that question was taken as a variation directly from the RMP regulation, and I've got it quoted up here. Taken in isolation, if they had an incident investigation on that slip, trip, and fall prior to the RMP, then it's easy to think that it should have been included in that RMP submittal. And that's based off of this first part, 170, where it just says, list the most recent date of the last incident investigation. So this is a perfect example of a checklist question that was taken directly from the regulation, but it provides no context. In this case, the context was way up in Section 60 of the RMP regulation that states that the facility shall investigate incidents that did result or reasonably could have resulted in the release of a highly hazardous chemical. So this is referring to specific process safety events, not slip, trip, and falls. So this highlights why it's so important to really understand the regulation, the intent of the regulation, and then be aware of that as you go through the checklist. Remember how I told you that it was great to have a new person on audits on the team? Well, likely as not, it would be a new person that would end up catching something like this, and really they'll help add the context to your audit checklist. And you should listen to it. You should add it. All right, and then last, I think it's really important to understand the site itself. You need to understand the site's procedure and how they execute things. Obviously, you'll get that from the documentation review. But then how the culture is can be a big influence on their PSM programs. And then what are the potential challenges that they face? So one big indicator for me is size and type of the site itself. For instance, a large refinery that maybe employs 500 people and has another couple hundred contractors at any given time, they're going to have an advantage of probably having some more PSM type resources at their disposal, but they likely have an issue with communicating the PSM program to all those employees consistently. So that might be a place to really look and delve into. Versus if you go audit a small distribution facility that's maybe only employing 5 people, they're likely to have some really good communication between those 5 people, but they may be really stretched thin on fully implementing the PSM program itself. All right, the third aspect, D, document, document, document. So when it comes to documentation, remember the 3 C's. You want to be consistent, you want to be clear, and you want to be concise. Remember that final report that you end up delivering serves as a legal document for that site for the next 6 years. The verbiage and the message that you put in there is extremely important. So sometimes the most challenging item is to be consistent when you've assembled a really diverse A team and everyone's writing their own findings in a different way. So me personally, I like to have 2 meetings at the end of every day of the on-site audit. The first is with the A team, the auditors, to review the findings of the day. In this meeting, the wording of the findings are scrutinized for consistency, for clarity and conciseness, as well as their validity. The second meeting then is to communicate those findings to the site stakeholders. Talk more on that in a little bit. All right, show me the data. If you're going to have those stakeholder meetings at the end of the day, or even if you aren't, you better show the data on where those findings are coming from. 2 of the columns we have on our audit spreadsheets are findings and supporting data. And some auditors may disagree with me on this, but I feel it is equally important to document the items that passed the audit as well as fail. This helps future auditors or potential future OSHA inspectors or the site itself to show where the data was coming from previously. So the next auditor may come in and they may be having trouble finding something on the MOC procedure. The previous checklist can help in doing that. And so I think it's really important to document where that's coming from. In either case, finding or passing, you should document what you looked at, what you found, and add the context if necessary. So one thing that I feel really strongly about is you should report, document, and share what the site does extremely well. And it's important to communicate these in your daily meetings, the final closeout meeting, and the body of the final report. So all 3 of those communicate what that site is doing well. All too often, an audit can just bring up the site's deficiencies. I feel it's equally, if not more important, to call out the site's strengths. These strengths can be leveraged to help correct those deficiencies. But communicating those strengths also shows the facility personnel that you recognize it isn't all bad, and they're doing a good job in a lot of areas. All right, on to the interview. So in all phases of the audit, preparation, on-site visit, closeout, and feedback, it is important to be really aware of the different type of personalities that you're working with. I mean, this is important in your professional life regardless, but I would suggest it is even more critical during an audit. Why? Because an audit is really the perfect environment for an us against them mentality to develop. And at no place does this manifest itself more than at the interview stage. Now, after all, you are in there and you're auditing their performance on PSM programs. It is natural for everyone you interview to be a little bit defensive. So further, you're going to end up dealing with a wide range of personality. Now, I'll get a little stereotypical here and then just say that typically an interview with an engineer has a much different feel than an interview with an operator. And so you really got to treat each situation different and be able to think on your feet to make sure folks aren't on the defensive. So you got to take a step back and put yourself in their shoes. Now, how does this relate to them? How does this reflect on them? And how might they think this is going to affect them? How is their boss going to view them based on their answers? This really illustrates how important it is to understand the site's culture as well, what the implications are and how they treat deficiencies. And then back to selecting the A-team, now it's really also important to select auditors that are good with people and are quick on their feet for this very reason. So most of the time in interviews, unless they were in the kickoff, the purpose of the audit has not really been adequately explained to them. And I usually just try to start out the interviews with a little small talk not related to the audit to put them at ease. The last audit I had an operator that had a Patriot sticker on his hard hat. And the interview led off with a 5-minute conversation talking about how Tom Brady is the GOAT, and a little bit good-natured ripping about my favorite football team, the Cowboys. But if you haven't met them before, look, you've got about 5 minutes to establish that rapport. And after that, I launched into the purpose of the audit, and this is to help their facility improve. You need to be careful with your phrasing your questions so as not to put them on the defensive. All this, and we didn't even really discuss the personalities that are assembled A-team. And I know that most of you guys are probably thinking my personality most closely resembles Mr. T. And you would be right, because I, too, pity a fool. All right. Speaking of Mr. T, the T in audit stands for team building. So here's what I'll say about team building. Without this aspect, the compliance audit is nearly a lost cause. We've talked a lot about the A-team, the auditors themselves in this presentation. However, I would encourage you to think of everyone, the auditors, the facility management, the engineers, the operators, and the administrative staff of the facility, all as one team. And we recommend establishing this mentality as early as possible in the audit process. I can't stress this enough. The very nature of a compliance audit lends itself to being a very real risk of an us against them mentality. That is an environment of distrust, and that is the exact opposite of what we want. We want to establish trust with everyone involved. And everything we discussed previously does work to build that trust. Establishing an approach tailored to each facility and establishing the right team really sets a tone. The A-team demonstrating their expertise and understanding of the regulations builds that trust. Clear, concise, consistent documentation makes it evident that the document being handed over has been treated with care. And then the interviews can be that opportunity to really solidify the rapport with the facility. So establishing trust amongst the team will help deliver a better quality, more actionable audit, and will likely lead to that facility being better able to close that gaps because everybody in that facility has stacked hands on that final audit report and the path forward to correct deficiencies. All right, communication really is the key to establishing the trust amongst that team, the entire facility team. Communicate any gaps and potential findings you have early and often. We said it before, make that facility management and subject matter experts part of the decision. As I mentioned before, I recommend daily meetings with the SMEs and management to communicate gaps found and also share those positive observations. This brings the SMEs and management into the discussion and just doesn't dump it into their lap at the end of the audit. And keep those potential gaps as just that, potential. Make clear that these items are up for discussion. Invite that discussion, establish the communication, make them part of the team. All right. So in everything you do, from the preparation phase onward, we recommend that you leave the impression that the auditors, the A-team, are here to help. It's especially important to literally state this in your on-site kickoff meeting. To say something like this: hey, facility peeps, we realize that getting audit isn't the most fun thing in the world. Hey, we've been there too. We've been on the other side of this. But here's what we've got in common. We all have a common goal to keep the plant and the public safe. And now we know everyone here at this facility is working hard and doing a great job in a lot of areas. You wouldn't be employed if you weren't doing some really great things. You wouldn't be employed at a plant if you weren't safety conscious. Still, we all have our blind spots, and our role as auditors in this whole process is to find those blind spots and offer you practical solutions to help correct them. We are really looking forward to working together in this effort. Ultimately, what you'll receive at the end of this audit is a document that highlights the improvement items that, when corrected, will help us all go home to our families. Us auditors, we're not going to decide on these items in isolation. Everyone in this room will stack hands on the report with a few possible exceptions and agree to a path forward. We're here to help and play a small role in your long-term success. So, as I mentioned before, one of my favorite aspects of compliance audits is the opportunity for learning. And I always like to set the tone with my A-team that the part of our goal in these audits is to assist that facility to become better at PSM, lend our knowledge on the solutions we've seen, but also important and not to be forgotten is a learning opportunity. It's a learning opportunity to us. I want to repeat that last part. We as auditors should learn from the facility being audited, and we should communicate that that's one of our goals up front. So the other thing to make clear in that kickoff meeting is a goal is to have learning take place both ways. Come in with this attitude, and I promise you, you're going to find compliance audits quite enlightening. All right, we're towards the end of our presentation, and the last poll question here. What's the most frustrating barrier you've encountered in audits? Is it cooperation from the facility? Discovering information gaps? Managing the different personalities out there? Or is there something else? We're really curious to know about other barriers and what you might have encountered in past audits. Those are always fun to go and look at. Okay, so this one you may have to type something out under that other category because I doubt we hit all the barriers, so I'll give you guys a few more minutes on that. I'll tell you, for me, it is getting the actual documentation sometimes seems to be a big challenge to review that up front. And sometimes it's great, but you just never know. Okay, well, we'll close out this poll and wrap this presentation up. So again, just a recap of everything we talked about here. The audit method. A is your approach. U is your understanding. D, the documentation is critical. I, interview, potentially one of the more challenging things to do really, really well. And then T is build that team. Build that team not just with your auditors, but build it with the facility itself. So moving forward, we hope this presentation maybe sparked a few questions for you. How can you leverage that A-team? And how can that audit method really help you leverage your compliance audits? So we really appreciate you attending this webinar. At this point, I'll turn it over to Nahima for any questions that there might be.
Thanks, Dylan. Thank you again for the presentation. If you attendees have any questions for Dylan, please be sure to add them to the chat box and send that question to me as the host, and I'll read your question for Dylan. I do have a few questions for you, Dylan, that came in, so I'm just going to go ahead and read them off. For the first one, what are the implications of the new RMP regulations on compliance audits?
Well, I thought someone might ask this question. So again, I don't want to get too much into this. I don't want it to be a non-answer too. But the thing that I find the most interesting is the use of the independent third party to perform these compliance audits. So again, when this comes into play is if you have a facility that basically had an RMP reportable release, or if or if an agency comes in and does an audit and they find that there are significant compliance gaps, they can order you to have an independent third party audit. Now, what's interesting about it is the independent requirement. The independent requirement, it spells out a very specific definition of what that is, and you, as the independent third party, could not have done any work, significant amount of work to the facility prior to that audit, and then they are basically on a moratorium of doing any work for that facility 2 years after the compliance audit as well. So I find that really interesting. I don't know what the overall implications are going to be long term. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So we'll see. It'll also be interesting to see if this rule goes into effect as it's written now on February 19th. A lot of things can happen. They may kick that date out a little bit longer. Who knows what's going on with the government shutdown? So we'll see.
Okay, next question is, as a third-party auditor, how long do you typically spend preparing for an audit before you go on site?
Yeah, so good question. So I think I mentioned earlier it might be a good time to start the process 2 months in advance. And I'm not saying you're working solid 2 months on this. Just start the process, have the conversation, turn over, what expected documents you expect to get, allow time for the facility to gather that documentation, and maybe have an expectation meeting. And then what I'd say is once you have that documentation, it's probably a week reviewing that documentation in detail and setting up your on-site audit as far as the prep time. But that could vary a little bit depending on the facility. If you have a bigger facility with a lot of documents, you're going to want a bigger sample size. So that may take a little longer or shorter if you have a smaller facility.
Okay, the next question, how long should a typical PSM compliance audit take to complete?
Your typical audit is maximum of a week, I think. Some of it depends on how big you set your team as, whether it's a 2-person team or a 4-person team. A 4-person team obviously will shorten it a little bit, and some of it depends on facility size. It's really unique, but I'd say no longer than a week for sure.
Okay. What is one of the most common things you see audit teams do wrong?
That's a really good question. I have to go back to something I talked about in the presentation of just letting an us against them mentality fester. If you end up sensing that that's the case in your audit, you should really try to address it as quickly as possible and correct it. That type of mentality, that letting that develop, will really destroy your audit and the heartbeat and the quality of your audit and the ability for that site to act effectively on the recommendations that you end up giving, the findings and the recommendations.
And what advice would you give to a first-time audit lead?
I think you can't have too much preparation. Get as much preparation in as possible, and stay loose. You got put in that position for a reason, and go with your gut and your instincts on how to manage that. But overall, first-time audit lead, I'd recommend grabbing this presentation offline and going and applying the audit method.
Okay. Which is the best compliance-based audit or risk-based audit?
I guess I don't know the question. If you were going to, I guess I don't understand the question on this one. So the compliance audit is required. I mean, you just need to do that regardless. You're going to have to go through each element and basically check off whether or not you comply or you don't comply. If you're going through like risk-based audit in terms of saying what has the most potential to have a catastrophic failure, I mean, I think that's good too, but it's not going to meet the intent of a compliance audit, in my opinion.
Okay. What percent do you consider to be statistically significant when doing documentation review? Do you document how many items you have reviewed?
Yes, yeah, you should. I think that's definitely something that should be done in terms of how many you've reviewed. The statistically significant part, that comes from OSHA's Appendix C, which is a best practice. So I recommend doing it. You can find guidance on that out there as far as statistically significant sample sizes. And I think we'll probably send out some sort of reference document after this. So I'll find where that link is and get it to you.
All right. Where would I find the MI regulations for an oil blending facility?
I don't know that answer offhand on all the regulations that would fit that bill, but I would say the API regulations are a great place to start, and you can get those API regulations. Sorry, not the regulations, the codes, API codes and recommended practices. You can get them off of the API website. The ones that I'm most familiar with are 510, 650, 653, 570, et cetera. But I'm no MI expert, but we could definitely ask our MI consultant on that, our senior API inspector, where he would recommend.
All right. Where would I find a sample checklist?
Well, so I think a good basis for the checklist is actually the OSHA Compliance Directive itself, and you can just look up Google PSM Compliance Directive. Again, I'll put this as a link on the website. And that's really a good basis to start with. I don't know of one that just is out there on the internet in a checklist form already, but I bet they're out there. So we can look for that too.
Okay. You mentioned an API specialist for the MI element. How in-depth should this specialist be reviewing? Does this person go into the multitude of API standards as far as compliance?
Yes. Yeah, so it's not going to be like a line-by-line item from all the API standards. It will be a line-by-line item essentially from the regulation. But our checklist is pretty extensive in terms of some of the things that the API does require. So, yeah, you do want to have a person that has a really good working knowledge, and the checklist should address the RAGA gap that MI talks about.
Okay. Dylan, I think that's the last question I have. I don't see anything else in the chat box. So if you have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, you can send it to producer@aiche.org. I just want to take the time to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Thank you, Providence, for sponsoring this. And you can go to our website at aiche.org to check out more webinars that we've got listed on our calendar. Once you're done viewing this webinar, to download your PDH certificate, you must visit the webinar page on the Academy site and click on the link provided below. Please make sure that you're logged into your account in order to do so. Again, thank you, Dylan, thank you, Providence, and thank you, everyone, for attending.